Some stories begin with a gunshot or a battle. This one begins with a woman who refused to die. The wind moved slowly across the wide Arizona desert, pushing thin ribbons of dust across the pale sand and dry grass. A broken wagon track cut through the land like an old scar, stretching for miles toward the red hills on the horizon. Nothing moved for a long time except a lone hawk circling high above. But beneath that quiet sky, half hidden beside the trail, a young Apache warrior was still alive. Her name was Nayeli. Hours earlier, her people had been forced to retreat through this valley when a supply wagon overturned during a chaotic skirmish along the trail. Horses scattered. Smoke drifted into the desert air. When the dust settled, the tribe had to make a brutal choice. Nayeli had been trapped beneath the heavy wooden wheel. By the time the other warriors pulled her free, it was clear she could no longer travel with them across the harsh desert miles that lay ahead. Apache warriors survived by moving fast and far, sometimes 30 miles in a single day. A wounded fighter who could not ride meant danger for everyone. So the elders whispered a quiet prayer to the desert wind, placed Nayeli beneath the shade of a tilted wagon plank, and rode away before sunrise. It was the kind of decision the frontier forced upon people more often than anyone wanted to admit. Now the desert was silent again. Nayeli lay on the sand with her dark braid resting across her shoulder, her breathing steady but shallow. Her bow rested beside her, though she no longer had the strength to draw it. She stared out across the endless pale land without fear. Among the Apache, warriors were taught that courage was not loud. It was quiet. It meant accepting whatever the desert decided. The sun climbed higher, warming the dry air until heat shimmered above the ground. Hours passed. The hawk circled lower now, curious about the unmoving figure beside the trail. Then something changed. A distant sound broke the stillness. Hoofbeats. Slow at first, then closer. Nayeli heard it before she saw anything. Her hand tightened slightly around the handle of the small knife resting beside her. Not out of panic, but out of habit. A warrior never greeted strangers empty-handed. The rider appeared over. A low rise nearly 200 yards away, a tall chestnut horse stepping carefully along the old wagon path. The man in the saddle wore a wide hat that cast a shadow across his face and a weathered coat faded by years of desert sun. His name was Ethan Walker, though Nayeli did not know that yet. Ethan had been riding alone since dawn, following the same trail he had worked for nearly 15 years, moving cattle between scattered ranches across the Arizona territory. He knew the desert the way sailors knew the ocean. The wind, the dust, the quiet. But something about the trail ahead made him slow his horse. At first he thought it was driftwood from the broken wagon. Then he saw the shape move. Ethan pulled gently on the reins. The horse stopped. For a long moment the cowboy simply watched the figure lying beside the trail. A young Apache warrior stared back at him across the sunlit sand. Neither of them spoke. And in that silent moment, somewhere in the vast desert between them, two very different lives quietly changed direction. The cowboy did not reach for his rifle. Instead, Ethan Walker swung one boot slowly over the saddle and stepped down into the sand, his movements careful, the way a man moves when he does not want to startle a wild horse. The chestnut horse behind him lowered its head and breathed softly into the dry air. Ethan kept his hands where the woman could see them. Out here in the Arizona territory, silence could be more dangerous than gunfire, and he understood that the young Apache warrior lying in the dust had every reason to distrust him. For several long seconds neither of them moved. The desert wind slid across the open land, carrying the faint smell of sun-baked earth and creosote brush. Ethan studied her the way a trail rider studies a distant storm, calmly and without judgment. She was younger than he expected, perhaps no more than 20 years old, but her eyes held the steady calm of someone who had spent a lifetime facing hard choices. Dust clung to her dark hair and the leather of her clothing. Her bow rested beside her like a loyal companion waiting for orders that would never come. Ethan took 2 slow steps closer, stopping nearly 15 feet away, close enough to speak. Without shouting, far enough to show respect. The young warrior watched him with quiet intensity, her fingers still resting near the handle of the small knife. She did not look frightened. She looked prepared. Ethan tipped his hat slightly, the same polite gesture he used when greeting strangers on a long trail. His voice when he spoke was low and steady, shaped by years of talking more to cattle and wind than to people. I am not here to harm you. The woman studied him as though weighing the truth of those words against everything she had been taught about men like him. For a moment, the only sound between them was the wind brushing across the tall dry grass. Then she spoke, her English clear though careful. Leave me. Her voice carried no anger, only certainty. Ethan did not move. He glanced briefly across the empty horizon, noting the broken wagon pieces scattered along the trail and the faint lines of hoofprints fading into the distance. Whatever had happened here had ended hours ago, but the desert was patient. It would wait. He looked back at her and shook his head once. I cannot do that. The answer seemed to surprise her more than if he had drawn a weapon. Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying the man standing alone beneath the vast sky. Apache warriors do not ask strangers for help, she said quietly. Ethan allowed the faintest trace of a smile to touch the corner of his mouth. Good, he replied, because I have never trusted a man who waits for someone to ask. The wind shifted again, stirring the dust along the trail. The hawk overhead drifted farther across the sky, and in that wide, silent desert, something unspoken passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find out there in the empty miles of the frontier. For a long moment, the desert held its breath. Ethan Walker stood quietly in the sun, studying the young Apache warrior the way a rancher studies a wounded horse on the open range. He had spent half his life riding across lands where mistakes cost people everything, and one thing he had learned was that pride could keep a person alive just as easily as it could get them killed. Nayeli watched him with the same still patience. The knife remained in her hand, though the strength in her fingers had begun to fade beneath the rising heat of the afternoon sun. The distance between them was no more than 15 feet, but it might as well have been a mile of desert stone. Ethan slowly removed his hat and ran a hand across his dusty hair, glancing again across the scattered wagon debris along the trail. The story was easy enough to read for someone who had followed cattle drives through rough country for 15 years. Something had gone wrong with the supply wagon. Horses had panicked. People had scattered. And this young warrior had been left behind when the desert demanded a choice no one wanted to make. Ethan had seen hard choices before. Ranch hands left behind in blizzards. Injured riders abandoned during long drives across Texas. The frontier was not cruel because people were cruel. It was cruel because survival often moved faster than mercy. But as he looked back down at Nayeli, something about the calm way she held herself told him that leaving her there would stay with him longer than any trail he had ever ridden. He took one careful step closer, stopping again before the tension between them could snap. The wind shifted, lifting strands of Nayeli's dark hair across her cheek. She watched him approach without flinching. If you stay here, Ethan said slowly, the desert will take you before the sun goes down. She answered without hesitation. Then that is how my path ends. Ethan shook his head slightly. No, that is how a trail ends when nobody bothers to follow it. Nayeli studied him again, searching his face for mockery or pity. She found neither. Only the quiet stubbornness of a man who had spent too many years riding alone to argue with the desert about what was fair. The silence stretched between them again. Then Ethan made a decision the way cowboys often did, quickly and without ceremony. He turned back toward his horse and loosened the rolled blanket tied behind the saddle. The leather creaked softly in the dry air. Nayeli's eyes narrowed slightly as she watched him work. You are wasting your time, she said quietly. Apache warriors do not ride away from battles. Ethan lifted the blanket and walked back toward her. Maybe not, he replied calmly. But today you are not riding away. Today, you are riding with me. He knelt carefully beside her, placing the blanket in the sand. The hawk overhead drifted farther toward the red cliffs, and the desert wind carried the quiet sound of leather and dust across the empty trail. For the first time since the wagon accident that morning, the young Apache warrior hesitated. The hesitation in Nayeli's eyes lasted only a moment, but Ethan noticed it. Out on the frontier, a man learned to read small changes the way sailors read the wind. Pride was still there, strong as iron, but beneath it lived something else now. Exhaustion. The kind that came when the body had traveled farther than it should have, and the desert had begun asking for its price. Ethan spread the blanket across the sand with slow, deliberate care, as if he were setting down something important rather than a simple piece of trail gear. The sun had climbed high now, bright and unforgiving, pouring heat across the valley floor. In another hour the ground would be too hot for bare hands to rest on comfortably. Ethan glanced once more toward the distant ridges, calculating the distance in his head the way cowboys always did. His cabin sat nearly 6 miles north of the wagon trail, tucked into a shallow canyon where a spring still ran even in the driest months. 6 miles was not far for a horse. For a wounded traveler lying alone in the desert, it was the distance between survival and silence. Nayeli followed his gaze toward the horizon. The quiet understanding between them deepened without either of them saying a word. Finally she looked back at him. "You should leave," she said calmly. "My people will return for me when the sun falls." Ethan studied her face for several seconds. He could tell she believed that. Or perhaps she needed to believe it. The desert did not always return what it took. He spoke gently, but the firmness in his voice carried the weight of experience. "If your people were close enough to reach you before nightfall, they would already be here." The words hung in the dry air. Nayeli did not argue. Her dark eyes drifted briefly toward the distant wagon tracks before returning to the cowboy kneeling beside her. The silence between them stretched again, but it felt different now. Not hostile. Not friendly either. Something quieter. Then both. Ethan adjusted the blanket and then carefully slid one arm beneath her shoulders, moving slowly enough that she could pull away if she chose. She did not. The movement was awkward at first. The body of a trained warrior was not meant to be carried like this, and Ethan handled the moment with the same care a rancher used when lifting a newborn calf. The chestnut horse behind him shifted its weight, watching with calm patience. When Ethan finally lifted Nayeli onto the blanket, she drew in a slow breath, steady and controlled. The desert wind moved softly through the dry grass around them. "You are stubborn," she said quietly. Ethan allowed himself a faint smile. That is what people say when a man refuses to do the easy thing. He rose to his feet and secured the blanket across the saddle so she could rest safely against the front of the seat. The horse remained steady, as if it understood the importance of the moment. Ethan placed one hand lightly on the reins and looked down at the young warrior sitting carefully in the saddle. 6 miles, he said. "That is how far we ride." Nayeli looked out across the open desert one last time before nodding once, slowly, accepting the path that had just begun. The chestnut horse moved at an easy walking pace, its hooves pressing quiet marks into the pale desert sand as Ethan Walker guided it north along a narrow path only a seasoned rider would notice. The land here rolled gently between low hills dotted with dry mesquite and scattered stones warmed by the afternoon sun. 6 miles did not seem far when a man rode alone across open country, but with a wounded passenger resting carefully against the saddle horn, every step of the journey mattered. Nayeli sat steady in front of him, wrapped in the blanket Ethan had tied securely across the saddle. She held the leather strap he had looped loosely for her hands, her posture straight despite the long hours she had already endured. The wind brushed softly across her face as the horse moved forward. For a long time neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that belonged to the desert itself. Ethan had ridden these trails so many times that he no longer counted the miles by distance, but by landmarks. The tall split rock ahead meant they had traveled nearly 1 mile. The dry wash beyond it marked the halfway point, and when the red canyon walls appeared in the distance, a small spring waited there beneath cottonwood trees that had survived decades of harsh summers. After several minutes, Nayeli spoke without turning around. "Your cabin is in the canyon." Ethan nodded, even though she could not see him clearly. "You know this land." "I know enough," she replied. "My people cross these valleys when the seasons change." Her voice held no accusation, only observation. Ethan guided the horse carefully around a patch of loose gravel along the trail. "Then we both know the canyon will give us shade before sunset." Nayeli studied the open desert stretching around them. The wind lifted thin lines of dust across the valley floor. Somewhere far away a coyote called once, and then fell silent again. For the first time since he had found her beside the wagon trail, she allowed her shoulders to relax slightly against the blanket. Ethan noticed, but did not comment. A rider who pushed wounded travelers too hard often lost them before the journey ended. The chestnut horse stepped down into a shallow dry wash where smooth stones shifted under its hooves. Ethan slowed the reins, letting the animal choose its footing. When they climbed the opposite bank, the land ahead began to change. The distant red canyon walls rose slowly against the bright sky like an old fortress carved by wind and time. Cottonwood trees shimmered faintly near the canyon mouth, their green leaves standing out against the pale desert colors. Nayeli watched them approach. "Water," she said quietly. Ethan allowed himself a small nod. "The only spring for 10 miles in any direction. It kept my cattle alive more than once during bad summers." The horse continued forward, closing the last mile at the same patient pace. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the valley floor. As they entered the shade of the canyon walls, the air cooled noticeably, carrying the faint sound of running water hidden somewhere among the rocks ahead. Ethan eased the reins and looked down briefly at the young warrior riding before him. The desert had not claimed her today, but the journey they had just begun was only getting started. The canyon welcomed them with shade and the quiet promise of water hidden among the rocks. As Ethan Walker guided the chestnut horse beneath the tall cottonwood trees, the air grew cooler and the constant whisper of the desert wind softened into a gentle rustling of leaves. The small spring ran through the center of the narrow canyon, a thin ribbon of clear water winding between smooth stones before disappearing again into the sand farther downstream. Ethan slowed the horse to a stop beside a patch of grass where the animal could drink. For a moment, he simply sat there, letting the stillness settle around them. The long ride had taken nearly 2 hours, and though the distance had not been great, every mile had required careful attention. Finally, he slid down from the saddle and tied the reins loosely around a low branch. The horse lowered its head gratefully toward the water. Ethan turned back to Nayeli and spoke in the same calm voice he had used since the beginning. "We have arrived." The young Apache warriors studied the canyon walls rising around them, their red stone glowing softly in the late afternoon light. The place felt older than the trails crossing the desert beyond it, a place where time moved more slowly. Ethan loosened the blanket straps and carefully lifted her from the saddle, setting her gently on the ground beside the stream where the grass grew soft and green. Nayeli placed one hand against the earth to steady herself and looked down at the running water. The surface reflected the sky above in thin ripples of gold and blue. For the first time since morning, she allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment and breathe deeply. The desert had taken much from her that day, but the cool air of the canyon offered something in return. Ethan moved a few steps away to gather supplies from his saddlebag. A small tin cup, a worn canteen, a bundle of cloth strips he kept for trail injuries among cattle hands. Nothing fancy, just the kind of simple tools a man carried when he spent most of his life far from towns and doctors. When he returned, he knelt beside the stream and filled the tin cup with water before handing it to her. "Drink slowly," he said. "The spring runs year-round, but the desert does not. Forgive men who rush things." Nayeli accepted the cup with steady hands and drank carefully. The cool water eased the dryness in her throat that the long day of sun had left behind. After a moment, she looked toward the narrow canyon opening where the fading sunlight still touched the valley beyond. "Your home is quiet," she said softly. Ethan followed her gaze. "Quiet keeps trouble away most days." He paused before adding in a thoughtful tone, "And when trouble does arrive, it gives a man enough time to see it coming." The canyon fell silent again except for the sound of the spring flowing over stone. The sun had begun slipping lower behind the canyon walls, and long shadows stretched across the ground beneath the cottonwood trees. As the evening air cooled, the desert beyond the canyon continued its endless watch. But here beside the small spring, two strangers now shared a fragile moment of shelter in a land that rarely offered it. Evening settled slowly over the canyon as the sun slipped behind the red stone walls, leaving the sky painted in long bands of amber and deep blue. The cottonwood leaves whispered softly above the narrow stream, and the small spring continued its quiet journey over smooth rocks that had likely rested there for centuries. Ethan Walker sat on a flat stone near the water, carefully rinsing the dust from the cloth strips he had taken from his saddlebag. The long ride through the desert had left a thin layer of grit across everything, and he preferred clean bandages when tending to any injury, whether it belonged to a ranch hand or a stranger found beside a wagon trail. Nayeli watched him from the grass where he had placed the folded blanket beneath her. The fading light caught the edges of her dark hair and the calm focus in her eyes. She had not spoken for several minutes, but her attention followed each careful movement Ethan made beside the stream. Out here in the frontier, actions often revealed more truth than words. Ethan returned with the damp cloth strips and knelt beside her, his expression steady and thoughtful. The canyon air had grown cooler now, and the long heat of the day was beginning to fade from the ground. "We should make you comfortable before night arrives," he said quietly. "The desert grows cold faster than most travelers expect." Naeli gave a small nod. She had spent enough seasons crossing open country to understand the truth of that. Ethan arranged the blanket more securely around her and placed another folded cloth beneath her shoulders so she could sit upright without strain. His movements remained careful and respectful, as if he were tending to a fellow rider after a hard day on the trail rather than a warrior from a tribe most towns in the territory feared. When he finished, he stepped back and studied the small camp forming beside the spring. The chestnut horse grazed calmly nearby, the sound of its slow chewing blending with the steady trickle of water. The canyon itself seemed to settle into the quiet rhythm of evening. After a moment, Naeli spoke again, her voice calm but curious. "You did not ask my name." Ethan leaned back against the trunk of a cottonwood tree and rested his hat across his knee. "Out here," he said, "a name usually comes after a man decides whether he trusts someone." Naeli considered that answer for a moment. Then she said simply, "Naeli." Ethan nodded once. "Ethan Walker." The introduction carried no ceremony, yet it seemed to shift something in the air between them. The desert often brought strangers together for brief moments before sending them back along separate trails, but sometimes the land had other plans. Naeli studied the canyon walls rising around the spring. "You live alone here." Ethan followed her gaze toward the narrow opening where the last light of the valley was fading. "Most days, yes. Cattle do not argue much, and the wind makes decent conversation if a man listens long enough." A faint hint of amusement touched Naeli's expression for the first time. The silence that followed was no longer cautious. It had become something steadier. Above them, the first evening star appeared against the deepening sky, and the small spring continued its quiet song beneath the cottonwood trees. Neither of them knew yet how much that quiet canyon would soon matter. The night settled gently over the canyon, and the last light of the desert faded behind the distant ridges like a door slowly closing on the day. The sky above the cottonwood trees deepened into a wide blanket of stars, each one bright against the dark silence of the frontier. Ethan Walker had built a small fire beside the stream using dry mesquite branches he kept stacked near the edge of the canyon. The flames burned low and steady, giving off just enough warmth to push back the cool desert air that followed sunset. The chestnut horse stood nearby with its head lowered, resting calmly after the long ride across the valley. Naeli sat against the folded blankets Ethan had arranged for her, watching the small fire reflect in the moving water of the spring. The quiet here felt different from the silence of the open desert. In the valley, the wind had carried endless space with it, but inside the canyon the stone walls held the sound close, as though the land itself were listening. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Ethan stirred the fire once with a small stick and then leaned back against the cottonwood tree again. The long day had left a tired heaviness in his shoulders, but it was the good kind of exhaustion that came from finishing a hard trail. Naeli broke the silence first. "When your people find you helping an Apache warrior," she said quietly, "what will they say?" Ethan considered the question without looking away from the fire. "Most people in the nearest town mind their own business when they are smart enough," he replied. "Those who do not usually learn the hard way that the desert does not belong to any one man." Naeli studied him carefully. "You speak as though the land chooses its own people." Ethan nodded slightly. "In a way, it does. Some men fight the desert every day of their lives. Others learn to ride with it." The fire crackled softly, sending a small trail of sparks upward into the dark sky. The steady sound of the spring continued beneath the cottonwood trees, a quiet reminder that life could still grow even in harsh places. Naeli rested her hands on the blanket across her lap, her expression thoughtful. "My people say something similar," she said. "The earth remembers who walks gently across it." Ethan allowed a faint smile to cross his face. "Then it seems the desert has been teaching both of us the same lessons." The canyon fell quiet again after that. Somewhere farther down the valley an owl called once before disappearing back into the night. Above them the stars stretched from horizon to horizon, brighter than any town lamp could ever be. Naeli looked up at the sky for a long moment, her eyes following the constellations her people had used for generations to guide travelers across the desert. Then she spoke in a softer voice than before. When morning comes, my people may search this valley. Ethan lifted his hat and brushed a bit of dust from the brim before setting it back down on his knee. If they do, he said calmly, they will find you alive. And out here that is usually the only answer that matters. The small fire continued to burn beside the stream, its warm light flickering across the canyon walls as the long desert night carried quietly forward. Morning arrived quietly in the canyon. The first light of dawn slipped over the red stone walls and filtered through the cottonwood leaves, turning the thin stream beside them into a ribbon of pale gold. The small fire had burned down to warm coals during the night, and the desert air carried the fresh chill that always came just before the sun climbed high again. Ethan Walker had been awake for nearly an hour, sitting on the same flat stone beside the spring while the canyon slowly filled with light. Years of cattle drives had trained him to rise before the sun, whether he needed to or not. The chestnut horse drank from the stream and then wandered lazily through the grass near the trees. Naeli opened her eyes as the warmth of the early sunlight reached the blanket around her shoulders. For a moment she simply listened. The quiet trickle of water, the faint rustling of leaves overhead. Somewhere farther out in the desert a distant hawk called once, circling the brightening sky. She turned her head and saw Ethan sitting nearby, calmly sharpening a small knife with a smooth river stone. You do not sleep much, she said. Ethan glanced up and allowed a faint smile. A man who works cattle learns to sleep when the land allows it. This canyon is peaceful enough that I trust it. Naeli studied the morning light spreading slowly across the canyon floor. The long night had passed without trouble, but something in the stillness of the desert beyond the canyon mouth had begun to change. Ethan noticed it too. He stood slowly and looked toward the valley opening where the sunlight now touched the distant sand. The ground out there carried stories for anyone who knew how to read them. After a moment he spoke quietly. Riders. Naeli followed his gaze. Far across the open desert, small shapes moved along the ridge line like shadows against the rising sun. Even at that distance the rhythm of the horses told a clear story. They were searching. Naeli remained calm, but her eyes sharpened slightly as she counted them. Several riders approached the canyon mouth before slowing their horses. Ethan rested his hand lightly against the trunk of the cottonwood tree, watching without tension. Within a few minutes the first rider guided his horse down the slope and entered the canyon. He wore the traditional clothing of Naeli's people, and behind him several more warriors followed in quiet formation. They stopped when they saw the small camp beside the spring. The lead rider studied the scene carefully before dismounting and walking forward. His expression was serious but not hostile. His eyes moved from Ethan to Naeli and then back again. Naeli raised her chin slightly and spoke in her own language first, her voice steady and clear in the cool morning air. The tension among the riders softened almost immediately. The man who appeared to be their leader listened closely and then nodded once. He stepped forward and addressed Ethan in careful English. You brought her out of the desert. Ethan gave a simple nod. She was still breathing. The man studied him for another moment before speaking again. Then the land guided you well. He turned back toward the waiting riders and spoke quietly to them. The warriors relaxed slightly in their saddles. Naeli looked once more toward Ethan. The desert wind moved gently through the canyon trees as the morning sun climbed higher above the red stone walls. Out on the frontier, many paths crossed for only a short time. But some meetings left their mark on the land long after the riders had gone their separate ways.